Welcome, Fright Night Vault listeners. The Wilburn Museum of Local History was not a place people wandered into by chance. Its stone facade rose at the end of a narrow street, the lamps outside throwing more shadow than light. The front steps were warped with age, and the sign above the double doors was so faded it could have belonged to another century. Inside, the air was unnaturally cool, scented with dust and something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. It was nearly closing time when Alex, Jenna, Marcus, and Claire stepped inside. This had been Marcus's idea, a dare he had been carrying around since hearing about the museum's most notorious attraction, a room of so-called haunted dolls. The man at the ticket counter was gaunt to the point of looking carved from stone. His pale eyes moved over each of them slowly. His voice rasped as he gave the same warning he had given for decades. Mind the ropes. Do not touch the displays, and under no circumstances enter the lower east wing. He slid 4 paper tickets across the counter, his expression unchanged. They drifted through the first rooms, past cases of tarnished silverware, yellowed photographs, and stuffed animals with glass eyes that never blinked. The floorboards whispered under their feet. The light seemed to dim the further they went. Then they found the doorway. Black wood framing, faded gold letters above it. The doll room. A velvet rope sagged across the entrance. Beyond it, rows of glass cases glowed under solitary yellow bulbs. Inside, porcelain faces stared from the shadows. Some smiled. Some frowned. Some were cracked from age. They moved past a sailor doll with one eye missing, a marionette whose strings were frayed to threads, a baby doll's head held on by rusting wire. At the far end stood the largest case. It was carved from dark wood, the looping patterns in its frame seeming to shift if you looked too long. Inside sat a life-size doll in a high-backed chair. Her skin was the pale green of something left too long in water. Her hair, a black tangle, spilled over one shoulder. Around her neck hung a silver chain with a cracked opal pendant that caught the dim light in strange, wet glimmers. Jenna leaned forward to read the plaque. Object 47, origin unknown. Recovered from an estate sale in Providence, Rhode Island, 1964. Found in a locked attic alongside several smaller dolls. No ownership records located. Known locally as the Listener. Marcus gave a low laugh. Looks expensive. Jenna's voice was sharp. Don't. But Marcus was already unclasping the case's simple brass latch. The air that spilled out was damp, carrying the heavy sweetness of rot. He reached in and lifted the necklace free. "Relax," he said. "Ghosts aren't real." They left quickly. The man from the counter was gone when they passed the lobby. Outside, the night was thick and warm, their laughter returning in uneasy bursts. That night, Marcus tossed the necklace onto his dresser, the opal catching a glint of streetlight through the blinds. Sleep came easily. The night was quiet, until it wasn't. At 1:26 in the morning, Marcus opened his eyes with the certainty that someone was in the room. The opal glowed faintly. From the hallway came the soft drag of bare feet across the floor. Marcus lay frozen, the sound pulling at every nerve in his body. The dragging steps moved closer, unhurried, as if whoever, whatever, was in the hallway knew there was nowhere for him to go. He sat up slowly, his eyes fixed on the bedroom doorway. Nothing moved there. The air felt heavier than it had moments before, thick enough to taste. The sound stopped. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet sinking into the carpet. Every instinct told him to turn on the light, but he didn't. He walked to the doorway and looked down the hall. The apartment was still. Too still. When he turned back toward the bed, the necklace was no longer on the dresser. It lay on the center of his pillow. Marcus stared at it for a long time, his pulse thudding in his ears. He picked it up, the chain cold against his skin. The opal seemed to pulse faintly in the dark, like a slow heartbeat. He set it back on the dresser and crawled under the blanket. His eyes stayed open until dawn. The next morning, the world felt thinner somehow. Colors muted, sounds distant. Jenna called, her voice tight. She asked if he had slept well. When he hesitated, she changed the subject. Marcus didn't mention the footsteps or the necklace. He didn't mention the way the air in his apartment still felt wrong. By nightfall, the unease had thickened into something he could almost hear. A faint vibration under the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock. At 1:57 in the morning, his eyes snapped open without warning. The necklace was resting on his chest, the chain looped twice around his neck. He sat up fast, yanking it away. The opal was warm this time, almost hot. From the darkness beyond the doorway came a single, deliberate knock. The knock echoed through the apartment, low and hollow, as if the sound had traveled a long way to reach him. Marcus stayed still, clutching the necklace in his fist. His breath was shallow, the air tasting faintly of that same rotting sweetness from the museum. A second knock followed. Slower, closer. He turned toward the door and saw it move. Just a fraction, the latch clicking softly. The gap was no wider than a coin, but darkness pressed through it like liquid. The third knock came from inside the room. Marcus's grip on the necklace tightened until the chain cut into his palm. He reached for the lamp. The bulb flared once, then died, leaving only the dim outline of the dresser against the far wall. Something shifted there. The opal pendant was no longer in his hand. It was standing upright on the dresser, balanced impossibly on its edge. It tipped forward. The sound of it hitting the wood was drowned by the whisper of bare feet moving toward him. He backed up until his shoulders touched the wall. His eyes strained against the dark, catching the faint glint of glass where the hallway met the bedroom. A face. Cracked porcelain, hair hanging in limp black strands, head tilted in silent study. She moved without moving. One blink, and she was half the distance to the bed. Another blink, and she was standing at the foot of it. The opal hung from her neck now, glowing faintly with each imagined breath. Marcus shut his eyes. When he opened them, the room was empty. The clock read 2:59 a.m. The second hand on the clock ticked toward the top, each movement louder than it should have been. Marcus sat frozen, his eyes locked on the empty space where the doll had been. When the clock clicked to 3 o'clock exactly, the room changed. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing against his chest. Every shadow in the room seemed to lean toward him. The sound came again, the slow drag of feet on the carpet. But this time it came from all directions at once. A whisper brushed his ear, too faint to make out, followed by a low, deliberate inhale, as if something were breathing him in. The mattress dipped at his feet. Then again, higher up, the weight crawling toward his chest. Marcus's body locked. He could not move, could not call out. The cold spread through him in thin, piercing threads, radiating from where the weight pressed down. His eyes darted toward the dresser. The opal lay there once more, but it was glowing now, brighter than before, the cracked surface leaking a faint white mist into the air. The weight reached his chest. Fingers pressed into his skin. His vision blurred, but in the haze he could make out her face again. The green-tinged porcelain, the fractured jaw, the eyes fixed wide open. The chain slid up around his neck, tightened. Something cold pressed against his temples, a feeling so deep it felt like it was inside his skull. The room tilted. The air swallowed all sound, and then there was nothing but the endless, heavy quiet. When he opened his eyes, he was standing, not in his bedroom. The glass walls around him were fogged with age, the air stale and unmoving. Across from him, in another chair, the doll sat perfectly still. Between them, the high-backed wooden arms and carved frame he had seen in the museum. He tried to move, but his body would not obey. Outside the glass, footsteps approached. The footsteps outside the glass were slow, deliberate, the sound of rubber soles on old wood. They stopped just beyond the fogged pane. A blurred shape moved, too tall to be the doll, too still to be a normal person. Marcus tried to speak, but his voice came out as a dry rasp that seemed to echo inside his skull instead of in the air. His breath fogged the inside of the glass. That was the only movement he could make. A faint scratching sound began near his left ear. Not on the glass, but inside it, as if something were etching lines between them. He turned his eyes and caught the faintest glimpse of letters taking shape. "Hello, Marcus." The words faded almost as quickly as they appeared. The shape outside moved again, circling. He could not see its face, only the thin outline of a head turning toward the other figure in the room. The doll. She was no longer in the same position. Her head had shifted, now tilted toward him. The opal pendant glowed with a steady, unnatural light, the cracks in its surface leaking a faint white vapor that curled upward and vanished. Marcus tried to lean away, but his body remained fixed. The vapor thickened, creeping across the narrow space between them. It slid along the floor, clung to his ankles, and began to rise. The smell of rotting flowers filled the chamber, choking him with sweetness. Somewhere beyond the glass, a door creaked open. The footsteps receded. The doll's lips parted. From the unmoving porcelain came a voice, not loud, not even fully audible, but felt in the bones of his skull. "You will not leave me again." The vapor reached his knees. The opal's glow pulsed faster, each beat pulling the air from his lungs until his chest burned. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Marcus was back in his bed, drenched in sweat, the necklace lying cold on his chest. The clock read 3:27 a.m. He didn't move until daylight. Morning light did nothing to clear the heaviness in Marcus's chest. The air in the apartment still felt stale, as though it had been sealed shut for years. The necklace lay exactly where it had been when he woke, centered on his chest, chain perfectly coiled, the opal dim but not dead. He left it on the dresser and went about his day without touching it. Yet, no matter where he moved in the apartment, he could feel it there, the way you can feel someone watching from across a room. By noon, Jenna still hadn't answered his messages. Claire's number rang without going to voicemail. Alex finally replied with a single line. "Stop talking about the doll." Marcus hadn't told him anything. He left the apartment for the rest of the afternoon, wandering the streets with no direction. But the farther he went from home, the stranger it became. Reflections in shop windows lagged a fraction behind his movements. A woman he passed on the sidewalk flinched as if she'd been burned, whispering something he couldn't catch. By early evening, he was back in his building, climbing the steps without remembering deciding to come home. The door to his apartment was ajar. Inside, nothing looked out of place, except for the necklace. It was now hanging on the hook where he kept his keys. Marcus backed into the hallway and dialed Alex. This time the call connected, but what came through wasn't Alex's voice. It was the slow, deliberate sound of someone breathing. He hung up and slammed the door shut. The hum in the air began again. Louder this time, vibrating through the walls and into the floor. The apartment seemed smaller with each passing minute. At 1:49 a.m., the hum stopped, and then came the knock. Not at the door, at the window, 5th floor. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and far too high off the ground to belong to anyone human. Marcus stared at the glass, his pulse climbing with each breath. The blinds hung still. No wind, no movement, only the echo of that single knock lingering in the air. Another came, softer this time, followed by a faint scrape. Something was dragging across the outside of the window. Marcus stepped back, his bare feet whispering against the floorboards. He wanted to believe it was a branch, but there were no trees anywhere near this side of the building. He lived in a wall of concrete and brick. The scrape circled the glass. Then came the tapping, not random, not impatient, slow, steady, deliberate. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. The blinds swayed once. Through the narrow gap between the slats, he saw it. 2 white points, faint and unblinking. Eyes set too far apart, their glassy surface catching the dim glow of the street lamp far below. The face beyond them was a map of fine fractures, the kind that spiderweb over ceramic after a fall. The black hair clung to the surface as though wet. The thing on the other side of the glass tilted its head slowly, the motion unnervingly fluid. Then, without warning, the latch on the window turned. Marcus stumbled backward. The glass didn't open, but the figure pressed its face against it, the fractures deepening, tiny flakes of porcelain drifting down the pane like pale snow. When he blinked, the window was empty. The blinds settled. From behind him, near the dresser, came the soft click of a chain. The opal was around his neck again. Marcus didn't remember touching the necklace, yet the weight of it on his chest felt absolute, the chain snug against his skin. He tore it off and flung it toward the dresser, but it never hit the wood. The air seemed to swallow it, leaving only the faint smell of rotting flowers. Sleep never came. He sat in the living room with every light on, the TV tuned to static for the background noise. The hum in the apartment rose and fell like the tide, sometimes faint enough to ignore, sometimes so loud it made the walls shiver. At 2:37 a.m., his phone lit up on the coffee table. Unknown number, he answered without speaking. The line hissed for a moment. Then a voice, dry, thin, and impossibly close, whispered his name. It was not a voice he knew, but it was a voice he recognized. The line went dead. The TV cut to black. The hum stopped. From the hallway came the sound of small, quick steps, the kind a child might make when running barefoot across the floor. They drew closer, pausing just outside the living room. Marcus turned his head slowly. She was standing in the doorway. The same cracked face, the same black tangle of hair, but the opal burned so brightly now that the fractured stone looked ready to split apart entirely. She stepped forward. The glow cast her shadow long across the wall, stretching past Marcus, curling upward onto the ceiling like a spider climbing toward him. The clock on the wall clicked to 2:59 a.m. Her shadow reached his feet. The second hand slid into place, and the clock struck 3 o'clock. The shadow lifted from the floor, peeling itself upward until it stood over Marcus, its shape warped and twitching, arms impossibly long, fingers like thin wires reaching for his face. The real figure moved in perfect unison, closing the space between them in a single silent step. The air in the room turned heavy, pressing down on him until his chest felt ready to collapse. Every sound dulled, the hum gone, the city beyond the window erased, leaving only the faint crackle of the opal's glow. Her fingers touched his temples. Cold shot straight into the center of his skull, burning outward until it filled every nerve. His vision stuttered. The walls stretched taller, the furniture pulling away, the light in the room collapsing into a narrow, pulsing glow that came only from the stone around her neck. Marcus tried to move, but the cold locked him in place. His breath came shallow, and each inhale pulled the sweetness of rotting flowers deeper into his lungs. The room fell away completely. He was in a narrow corridor now, lined on both sides with glass cases. Each case held a figure, men, women, children, all seated in high-backed chairs, their faces pale and cracked, their eyes wide open. Every head turned toward him in perfect unison. The doll stood at the far end, waiting, her head tilted. She lifted the opal from her own neck and held it out. Marcus felt his legs moving toward her, though he hadn't given the command. The figures in the cases began to shift, their heads following him, some lips parting just enough to reveal teeth like tiny shards of porcelain. By the time he reached her, the opal was inches from his chest. It pulsed once, twice, and then it sank into him. The moment the opal sank into his chest, Marcus felt his heartbeat stutter. The cold inside him thickened, turning into a deep, steady thrum that wasn't entirely his own. His vision blurred at the edges, the corridor swaying like it was underwater. The doll stepped closer. Her porcelain fingers reached toward his face, brushing his cheek in a touch so light it might have been a breeze. Yet the skin beneath it went numb instantly. Marcus tried to speak, to demand she let him go, but the words dissolved before leaving his throat. The hum returned, not in the air this time, but inside his skull, matching the rhythm of the opal's glow now burning just beneath his skin. From the glass cases on either side, the other figures began to stir. Chairs creaked, heads turned further, fingers scraped against armrests. One by one they leaned forward, their stares locking onto him like hunters scenting fresh blood. The doll's head tilted further, the fracture along her jaw deepening as if it were trying to smile. Her lips didn't move, but her voice slid directly into his mind. "You are mine now." The cases lining the corridor began to open. The occupants stepped out in silence, their feet making no sound against the floor. Their movements were stiff, deliberate, but they were all moving toward him. Marcus's knees buckled, but invisible hands held him upright. The numbness spread from his cheek down his neck, over his shoulders, and into his arms. He looked down to see the faint, spiderweb pattern of cracks forming under his skin. The doll placed her hands on either side of his head. Her glass eyes reflected him, but it wasn't him. The reflection's skin was pale, smooth, unbroken except for the same fine cracks, its eyes fixed in a wide, unblinking stare. The thrum in his chest grew louder, stronger, and with each pulse the Marcus he knew slipped further away. The hum became a roar inside his skull, yet no sound filled the corridor. The glow in his chest spread outward, spilling through the cracks in his skin like light leaking from a shattered vessel. The doll stepped back and the others closed in around him. They circled, faces inches from his own, their breath cold against his skin. Some still wore the clothes of centuries past. Some were dressed in faded modern fabrics, but all shared the same glassy stare. Marcus tried to scream, but his jaw refused to move. It was already setting into place. The numbness reached his lips, sealing them into a faint, lifeless curve. The corridor tilted, or maybe it was his vision breaking apart. The light from the opal surged once more, and for a moment he felt himself falling, not down, but inward, collapsing into the cold stillness inside the stone. When he could see again, he was seated. The high-backed chair pressed against his spine. The glass walls stood on all sides. His hands rested motionless on the armrests, his fingers stiff and pale. He tried to lift them, but they didn't obey. Outside the case, the doll walked past without looking at him. Another figure followed her, a man he almost recognized. Alex. Alex didn't seem to see him. He was looking past Marcus toward the far end of the corridor. The pale-eyed curator stood there, hands folded neatly, as if expecting him. The door closed behind them, and the light dimmed. Marcus stared straight ahead. He could not blink. He could not move. He could still feel the weight of the opal inside his chest. It was still beating. Days passed, or maybe years. Time no longer moved for Marcus in any way he could follow. There was only light and dark, the slow shuffle of visitors drifting past the glass, the murmur of voices he could not answer. They came in pairs, in groups, alone. Some lingered, tilting their heads as if something about him seemed almost familiar. Others hurried past, their eyes sliding away as though they'd seen too much. The doll sat in the next case, exactly as she had when he first saw her in the museum. Her head was tilted toward him now, the opal gone from her neck. Every so often, when no one else was near, she would turn her face fully toward him. Her eyes never moved, yet he could feel her watching. One evening, just before closing, a child pressed her small hands to the glass of his case. Her parents were too distracted to notice. He wanted to tell her to step back, to run, but his mouth stayed fixed in its brittle half-smile. The girl's eyes widened as if she could hear something no one else could. She whispered a single word. "Hello." The pale-eyed curator's voice echoed from the far end of the room, calling the last visitors to the exit. The child stepped away, but not before glancing at the doll beside him, and then back at Marcus. That night, long after the lights went out, the sound of footsteps returned. Slow, careful, coming from the dark beyond the cases. They stopped in front of his. The doll's head tilted farther, the fracture in her jaw deepening into something that might have been a grin. In the reflection of the glass, Marcus thought he saw someone standing behind him. Another figure, faint and pale, its face smooth and unbroken, its eyes empty. The opal inside his chest pulsed once. The museum opened the next morning without incident. The doll room looked the same as it always had, to those who didn't know better. And sometimes when the streets outside are quiet, a passerby swears they see a flicker of movement in the high windows. Just the faintest tilt of a head, watching. If you made it this far, you're one of us. Subscribe so you don't miss what crawls out next. If you have a horror story of your own, feel free to drop it in the comments. You never know. The next story could be yours. See you on the next one.